Most vehicles use an oil pressure light or oil pressure gauge to supply the driver with information about the engine oil pressure. In this video, we'll look at some of the most common problems associated with these warning devices. Any diagnosis of an oil pressure indicator is started by first checking the engine oil level. If the oil level is low, top it off with the grade and type of oil recommended by the manufacturer. If the vehicle is equipped with an oil pressure warning light and no gauge, test the light by turning the ignition key to the run position. The light should illuminate and stay on steady. To diagnose a bulb that doesn't light, begin by studying the schematic for the circuit you're working on. Most systems use one wire like the circuit shown here. However, if the circuit has two wires, then one of the wires is the circuit from the bulb to the switch and the other is the ground wire. Next, locate the oil pressure switch. It's usually located on the side of the engine block, but you might need the service information component locator to identify it. Once you've located the switch, disconnect the connector from the switch. If it's a one-wire switch, connect one end of a jumper wire to the terminal and the other end to a good ground. And if the circuit has two wires, connect the jumper wire between the two terminals. Finally, turn the ignition switch on and observe the light. If the light is on, the problem is a faulty switch or a bad ground. If the light still doesn't light, the problem is in the wiring from the bulb or the bulb itself. If the oil light remains on with the engine running, the first thing you should do is disconnect the wire from the sending switch. If the light goes out, the switch is shorted or the engine oil pressure is very low. To check the oil pressure, remove the switch and install a pressure gauge. Start the engine and observe the gauge reading. If the gauge reads normal pressure, then the switch is defective and must be replaced. However, if the gauge reads low, the problem is in the engine and must be diagnosed further. To test an oil pressure gauge, begin the diagnosis by starting the engine and observing the gauge itself. On most vehicles, the gauge should read above 20 psi with the engine at normal operating temperature. But it's always a good idea to check the specifications for the vehicle you're working on. If the gauge doesn't move or reads incorrectly, further testing is necessary. So, the next step is locating the oil pressure sending unit. It's usually located on the side of the engine block. Disconnect the connector and connect an ohm meter to the sensor terminals. Read the resistance of the sensor and compare the readings to the published specifications. If the readings are incorrect, the sensor is defective and must be replaced. Next, start the engine and observe the reading. Again, compare this reading with the specification. If the reading is within specifications, the problem is in the gauge circuit or the gauge itself. If the reading is not within specification, the engine oil pressure must be checked to determine whether the problem is in the engine or with the sensor. To test the engine oil pressure, remove the sensor from the engine block and install a pressure gauge in its place. Sometimes it will be necessary to use a fitting adapter to connect the gauge. Start the engine and read the gauge. If the reading is within specifications, the sensor is defective and must be replaced. If the gauge reading is low, an engine oil pressure problem is indicated and must be diagnosed. If the oil pressure gauge reading is normal and the sensor tests within specification, the problem is most likely in the wiring to the instrument panel or the instrument panel gauge.